Hello my friends. Today we're going to be talking about artists and creatives. Particularly, we're going to be talking about why it seems so damn difficult sometimes to call ourselves artists, to call ourselves creative, to claim that for ourselves. Why is it so challenging? It's something that I find really challenging personally, and I wanted to get into it over a little knit and chat. So I'm going to be knitting while we get into this topic, and if you want to pull up something that you're working on, you are more than welcome to do that, because this is going to be a little chatty video about a topic that has been on my mind for a while, and I just want to get into it. So I'll link what I'm working on in the description box. I will show you the yarn up close though, because it is quite pretty. And I'm really pleased with how these colors are turning out. They're really vibrant. I really like working on vibrant projects when it's fall or winter. It just kind of makes me feel a little bit more vibrant. So that is what I'm going to be working on while I knit, and I'm gonna just get into the topic. So artists, being a creative person, and why is it so hard to talk about it? Why is it so hard to call ourselves a creative person or an artistic person, or even just call ourselves an artist, saying, yeah, my name is Cassie, I'm an artist. Why is that so hard? I'll get a little bit into my background because I think there's a few reasons for why this is hard for me, and maybe some of you can relate to it. So I grew up as a very academic person. I grew up as someone who identified as being a good student, as being good at studying, being a good reader, a good writer, and I really loved all of those things. I still really like all of those things, and I still do identify with that to an extent. I really performed well in school because I studied really hard, and that made my parents happy, and so that was kind of the path that I pursued for a long time. I kind of felt like that was the direction that I had to go. And in terms of art and being an artist or being creative, I like to write, and I maybe considered myself to be a creative writer. But even then, even though I was writing poetry, even though I thought about writing books, I still mostly thought of myself as being an academic person. And this carried on into university, where I was writing poems and I was writing some stories. But even though I worked at a magazine, so I volunteered at a magazine that was like an arts magazine where we published artists and poets and short stories and all that stuff. Even though I worked there, I still considered myself more of an academic because I was on the team responsible for admitting these people into the magazine. I considered myself an art critic maybe, I considered myself an editor, but I didn't necessarily see myself as the one producing art, even though, like I said, I did like to write. I did like to write poems. I did, do some creative pursuits, but I just didn't recognize myself as an artist. I barely even recognized myself as a writer at the time, and I was writing constantly. So sometime in university, I started to take up knitting, and I did this because I had a very serious anxiety disorder in university. I still do, but it was something that I wasn't really able to manage very well. And my therapist actually suggested I take up a hobby, and so I took up knitting. And I did it because I needed something to keep my hands busy. I was a very fidgety person, and I really needed to keep my hands focused on something. So I started to knit. So I was knitting scarves mostly at that time, and I really liked doing this. It kept me busy, but I wasn't so focused on the finished product. I was mostly just focused on knitting and how that made me feel, and how it alleviated some of the pressure or some of the tension and the anxiety in my body. And then I noticed a friend who also knit started posting on Instagram maybe just after university. She started posting the things that she was knitting, and she was making beautiful color work projects. She was making really intricate lace patterns. She was making sweaters and gloves. And I looked at these things and I was just so blown away because I didn't even realize that you could make those things. And I thought to myself, wow, she's so talented. She is so creative. How does she pick those colors? How does she know the colors are going to go together? I was so impressed by her. And I thought to myself, that's not anything that I could ever do. I can't see myself ever being able to achieve that. And it wasn't until quite a few years later that I started to knit complex projects. And even when I did, I never allowed myself the same courtesy. I never told myself that I was skilled. I never felt like I was creative. I never felt like I was picking colors that were, really excellent combinations, or I didn't really afford myself the same sort of compliments that I gave to her so readily. And I was now at the same level that she was when I was looking at her work. I now sew a ton. I've experimented with different mediums, embroidery and block printing, and I know that I'm really good at crafts. And so what I have allowed myself to call myself is a crafty person. I've even maybe allowed myself to say I'm a creative person, but that still doesn't stick as comfortably. Crafty feels good because it feels like, yeah, I'm, experimenting, I'm playful. It doesn't feel serious and it doesn't feel professional, I guess, and it feels like it's lower stakes. Like, yeah, I'm a crafty person, but I'm not producing art necessarily. And that really always makes me wonder, like, what am I thinking of when I think about art? What am I, like, what classifies as art? Because fiber arts to me are a very, very real art. I've seen some really beautiful fiber artists, but do I consider myself in line with those fiber artists? Do I even consider myself a fiber artist? I don't know, and that's why I wanted to bring up this topic, because it's something that I have really struggled with for quite a while, because I just don't really know what to call myself. I can say I am a creative person now. That's maybe something that I wouldn't have even given myself the title of. I can see now that I am generating more creative ideas the more that I allow myself to generate creative ideas. So previously I would, just knit or just sew and follow a pattern and maybe make something in a similar colorway to what the designer was. But now I play around with hacking patterns, I play around with fabric combinations and thread combinations, and I play around with all sorts of things as I'm going. And I think, let my yarn come off my needle here. Let's put that back on. I think part of the issue that I've identified for myself when I think about whether I'm creative or I think about whether I'm an artist or any of those things is that I don't feel like I'm producing original ideas. There's all these like sort of threads or comments on TikTok that say like I don't have an original thought in my brain. Sometimes I feel like that. To me, an artist is someone who can generate ideas, who can come up with these original, beautiful ideas. And I know that that is a fallacy in itself, that art is not necessarily original, and that a lot of art is referential to other pieces of art, other things, whatever. I do know that. And so what I'm talking about here is not saying that like art is this, but rather what my brain kind of tells me, what the dialogue is in my own head. And so in my brain, like I said, artists are these people who come up with really creative ideas. They are people who look at something and get inspired and generate something that is so different than other people have seen before. Artists are people who create things that really inspire and people that educate and have a perspective. And when I think about the things that I create, it always feels like it's following what someone else has sort of set a blueprint for. Like, I'm really good at following instructions, which is why I'm good at knitting in my own brain. I love knitting, or I love sewing, but my sewing pretty much follows patterns which follow what other people have instructed for me to do. To me, it's like akin to building IKEA furniture. If you are good at following instructions, or if the instructions are good enough, I would say, then you can make something cool and functional and that you like. For me, I don't know that what I'm doing classifies as being artistic, because while it might seem artistic to create your own clothes or to embroider, oftentimes I feel like I'm following a blueprint, I'm following a template, and it's almost like paint by numbers. Like, you can't go wrong if you just follow the steps. And I think that is why I have such a hard time calling myself an artist or a fiber artist or even a creative, because I don't feel like I have the skills that artists and creatives have. The skills that I have are almost academic. I'm really good at reading. I'm really good at following instructions. I'm really good at following rules and getting, a good result out of it. And so I'm trying to challenge myself about this idea because I don't think it's wrong, but I don't necessarily think it's the whole truth either. Because the thing is that it is so nuanced, and my creativity blooms in different ways all the time. Like being able to look at a skein of yarn and being able to take that skein of yarn and imagine a project for it. So that's what I do with this, for example. I saw this yarn and I was like, okay, I want this to be a cardigan. And in my brain, I'm visualizing like what this cardigan could look like. Now, I made the choice to not try to make the pattern myself. I did end up finding a pattern, but there was visualization. I knew I wanted it to have a collar. I knew I wanted a button pocket. I knew I wanted it to fit a certain way. I had some ideas in my brain of like what this yarn would turn into. And that is a skill in itself. That is using this sort of like theoretical part of our brain, almost like architecture, right? To look at a flat material or to look at something and try to visualize it and make it become something else. And this wasn't something that I was good at before. When I first started knitting, when I first started sewing, visualizing projects from fabric, visualizing projects from yarn felt impossible. And so I would just stick with what the pattern recommended. And now more and more I am taking liberties to explore, what would happen if I were to play around with different threads on a pair of pants? Like what if I made contrast top stitching? Now that's not something that is called for in the pattern, but it would look really cool, and I can take inspiration from things that I've seen and sort of be able to visualize it and know that the result will come out how I want. Or what if I take a blank piece of fabric and I create a block and I block print it and I make a pattern on it. And so all of a sudden I've not only printed my own print on fabric, but I'm gonna then use that fabric to make something new. I'm gonna make a backpack, for example. I think this is a creative skill, this visualization. And being able to do this, being able to visualize something is inherently creative. And it only gets better the more that you practice it. And so I don't make my own patterns right now, but I also haven't tried to. And I wonder what kind of creativity I would unlock if I did try to make my own knitting patterns. What kind of creativity could I unlock if I tried to make my own sewing patterns or try to play around with designing? What would happen if I unlocked that part of my brain and stepped away from making what other people have laid out for me, from following patterns, and just played around more? What would happen if I just let myself play? And I think playing is a huge part of being creative, of being an artist, is giving yourself a little bit of freedom to mess up as well. And so that's something that I've been wanting to explore more, is a notion of playing in my own making practice. Moving away from design, moving away from patterns, moving away from blueprints of sorts, moving away to just see what happens if I let my brain do some fun things for a little while. What will it come up with if I just sit at my sewing machine and start piecing together fabric? What would happen if I take a garment in my wardrobe and I decide that I want to make something new with it and I draw out a design, or I draw out a few designs? I'd like to give myself permission to call myself creative and do creative exploration in my making practice. I really want to experiment with making wall hangings and making pillows for my craft room. I want to play around with scraps that I have. I want to try to make garments without a pattern and see what happens, and be less tied to results, be less tied to always having something come out perfectly. And I think a part of my limitation in calling myself an artist or calling myself creative is that I do have a large amount of resistance to failure. And especially as being like an online internet person, failing online feels embarrassing. It's so public. It's something I've been trying to allow myself to do more of. And creators who I really admire are creators who fail publicly over and over again and have the bravery and the courage to still share with others. So it's something that I think is really worth kind of trying out, is embracing artistry and playfulness and learning new techniques, even though learning new techniques is hard. Like, I just learned color work in a different project and I put it off for months. I have been wanting to do this project for a very long time. I've bought other color work patterns before, but I just felt such a resistance to it. But working on this color work project that I have feels so fun and it feels so freeing and it's much easier than I expected. But the idea of learning a new skill just felt like really challenging. Even this project, to be honest, I'm working with hand-dyed yarn, which I never have before because it felt scary because you have to do what's called helical knitting, I believe, and you basically have to alternate skeins of yarn. So I'm knitting from 2 skeins of yarn and I'm switching which skein I'm working from every 2 rows or so. And, with doing this, I had never done it before, and so I was putting it off. And it's really not difficult. I just was resisting trying a new technique because I didn't know how it would turn out. And I think a big part of how we get better at things, a big part of how we explore our creative depth is experimenting beyond perfection and allowing ourselves to make little mistakes, allowing those little flaws to pop up and accepting them and cherishing the work regardless. And I think that, as someone who came from an academic background, who was very close to going into academia, who almost wrote the LSAT, who thought that she was going in a very academic career, sometimes I still feel like I'm a baby creative because I'm still learning what it means to be creative and to allow myself creative expression. Because a lot of people have been practicing their creativity for a long time and I haven't been. I have only really been sewing for 3 years, knitting for a little longer than that, but not to this sort of scale or level. And I'm finally allowing myself to embrace my creative side. And of course, that's going to come in really slow increments sometimes. And it's not going to feel creative all the time. I'm still learning. I'm still learning how to exercise my creative brain because it was dormant for so long, because I didn't feel like an artist. I used to write poems, but I wouldn't allow myself to call myself a writer or a poet. And now, I don't know that if I'll ever call myself an artist, maybe a fiber artist someday. But even then, I still kind of default to feeling like a crafty person because crafty feels safe. Creative feels like I have to show something for my work. And there's nothing wrong with any of these terms. It's just a matter of finally feeling comfy with who I am and acknowledging what I want to bring to the table when I show up, with my work. Do I want to be pushing boundaries? Do I want to just be crafting and making things for fun? All of those things are okay. And I have been having a lot of fun getting more experimental and challenging myself to be more creative and think more creatively as well, because it is such a muscle and it gets exercised in such different ways all the time. And I've been feeling really excited about this creative journey. I've been feeling really inspired to push the boundaries of my creative practice a bit more and see where it takes me. Because like I said, I am brand new to being a creative person. I have only started to call myself a creative person within the past few years. I have always thought of myself as being more academic. And I think that this goes for a lot of us. I think that a lot of us didn't necessarily grow up crafty, or maybe we grew up thinking that we were going to work in academic jobs, and over the years we ended up in a position that took us further and further away from our initial plans. I went to school. At first I was going to apply for my master's, and then I decided not to at the last minute. I then was going to be a teacher, and I decided I didn't want to do that either. I thought I was going to work as a lawyer, and so I did work in a law firm for a little while and realized that I hated it, so I didn't end up writing the LSAT. I slowly but surely started to become closer and closer to who I am now by moving further and further away from what I thought I was, or how, I was sort of trained to be over years of school. And I think that is I think that goes for a lot of people as well, especially something like the fiber arts. Like, I was never really interested in drawing. I kind of lamented that I wasn't a good drawer or painter or artist, I would say, but I love the fiber arts. I'm so drawn to the fiber arts, and if I had known about the fiber arts earlier, maybe that's something I would have experimented with a lot faster. This is the medium that I find interesting and inspiring, and is the medium that I choose to play with and have fun with. And it is too bad that fiber arts isn't considered as, or isn't as appreciated or celebrated as a lot of other art forms. I think that is changing a bit, but I think fiber arts often kind of gets lumped into just crafts, because it's, you can get, I think it just gets lumped into being crafts, not into being art. All that to say, I really am feeling like I'm entering a new season in my own creativity, and I hope that you can also experiment with your own creativity, allow yourself to call yourself creative, allow yourself to try to understand what being creative means for you. That's what I'm trying to do for myself. And so thank you for being here. I really am excited to talk about this topic. I clearly had a lot to say. If you have any suggestions for another topic for a knit and chat, I'd love to hear about it in the comments, and I will see you next time. Bye!